Have you ever wondered why, in an era of unprecedented wealth and technological advancement, millions of people are being told that their depression, anxiety, and burnout are simply matters of personal mindset? Why is it that when wages stagnate, when healthcare bankrupts families, when education becomes unaffordable, the dominant response isn't to examine these systems, but instead to flood social media motivational quotes, telling you to think positive and change your perspective? What if I told you that this isn't coincidence, but rather the most sophisticated psychological operation ever deployed to protect an economic system that systematically generates the very suffering it then tells you to cure with better thought? The research is staggering and undeniable. Studies from Harvard Medical School show that countries with higher levels of economic inequality consistently report higher rates of mental health disorders, with the United States leading developed nations in anxiety and depression rates. The American Psychological Association's 2023 stress survey found that 76% of adults report economic concerns as their primary source of stress, yet the dominant cultural narrative continues to frame mental health as an individual failing requiring personal transformation. A comprehensive analysis published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health examined 34 countries over 2 decades and found a direct correlation between the implementation of neoliberal economic policy and rising suicide rates, particularly among working-age adults. This isn't about individual resilience or positive thinking. This is about systematic psychological warfare disguised as self-help. What you're experiencing isn't a personal deficiency in mental toughness or optimism. You're witnessing the calculated deployment of what economists call responsibilization, a mechanism where systemic failures are reframed as individual problems requiring individual solutions. This strategy wasn't accidental. It emerged directly from the economic theories of Milton, Friedman, and the Chicago School, which fundamentally restructured how societies understand the relationship between individual suffering and collective responsibility. Friedman's core premise was that free markets would naturally create optimal outcomes if individuals took complete personal responsibility for their circumstances. What he promised was freedom through individual choice. What he delivered was a system that transformed structural oppression into personal shame, economic exploitation into motivation deficit, and collective problems into individual pathologies. Today, I'm going to reveal 8 specific mechanisms that demonstrate how the mindset narrative functions as a psychological pressure valve for an economic system that cannot survive honest examination of its actual effects on human well-being. These aren't abstract theories, they're precise strategies that you encounter every day, designed to redirect your attention from external causes to internal solutions, ensuring that no matter how much you suffer under current conditions, you will blame yourself rather than questioning the conditions themselves. By the end of our time together, you'll understand exactly how your mental energy is being harvested and redirected to protect the very system causing your distress, and more importantly, you will have the tools to recognize and resist this manipulation. The first mechanism is what I call the individualization of systemic failure, and it operates through a fascinating inversion to Friedman's theory of personal responsibility. Friedman argued that free markets reward individual merit and that success or failure reflects personal choices within a fair system. His promise was elegant. Take responsibility for your outcomes, make rational choices in free market, and you'll achieve prosperity proportional to your effort and talent. The theory suggested that individual liberty and economic freedom were synonymous, that personal empowerment came through market participation, and that social problems would naturally resolve through countless individual decisions in competitive environments. But here's what actually happened, and the psychological research is crystal clear on this point. When economic systems consistently produce widespread financial stress, job insecurity, and social inequality, the mindset narrative emerges as a protective mechanism for those systems. Instead of examining why full-time workers can't afford housing, why college education creates decades of debt, or why medical emergencies destroy middle-class families financially, the focus shifts to individual psychological states. Studies from UCLA Psychology Department show that people experiencing economic stress who are exposed to positive mindset messaging actually report higher levels of shame and self-blame compared to those who receive information about systemic economic factors affecting their situation. The mechanism works like this in your daily life. You struggle to pay rent despite working multiple jobs, but instead of questioning why wages haven't kept pace with living costs for decades, you encounter hundreds of social media posts, podcasts, and articles telling you that your financial problems stem from limiting beliefs, scarcity mindset, or insufficient gratitude. The system has successfully transformed your rational response to irrational economic conditions into evidence of your personal psychological deficiency. You begin to suspect that your stress about money isn't caused by having insufficient money, but by having the wrong attitude about money. The actual economic pressures remain unchanged, but your mental energy is now consumed with self-improvement rather than system analysis. Research from Stanford's sociology department tracked this phenomenon across different economic sectors and found that workers experiencing wage stagnation who participated in corporate mindset training programs showed decreased likelihood of organizing for better conditions or seeking new employment, while simultaneously reporting increased personal responsibility for their financial stress. The mindset narrative doesn't solve economic problems. It psychologically adapts people to accept economic problems as permanent fixtures requiring personal accommodation rather than collective solution. The second mechanism builds directly on this foundation, the commodification of mental health recovery. Milton Friedman's vision of privatized services extended beyond traditional industry into areas like healthcare and education, based on his belief that market forces would create more efficient and effective solutions than government programs. He promised that privatizing these services would increase quality while reducing costs, that competition would drive innovation in addressing human needs, and that individual consumer choice would naturally optimize outcomes better than centralized planning. What emerged instead is a mental health industry that profits from treating symptoms while systematically avoiding discussion of root causes. The numbers are staggering. The global mental health software market is projected to reach $46 billion by 2027, with meditation apps, mood tracking platforms, and online therapy services experiencing explosive growth. Meanwhile, rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation continue climbing year over year. A longitudinal study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry analyzed mental health outcomes in relation to economic policies across 15 developed nations and found that countries with more privatized health consistently showed higher rates of treatment dependency with lower rates of long-term recovery. The psychological mechanism here is particularly insidious. When mental health becomes a consumer product, the focus necessarily shifts from eliminating causes of psychological distress to managing symptom distress. You download meditation apps to cope with work stress, rather than questioning why work environments systematically generate stress. You purchase therapy sessions to develop resilience against financial anxiety, rather than examining why financial systems create chronic insecurity for working people. You invest in wellness products to maintain emotional equilibrium under conditions designed to destabilize emotional equilibrium. This commodification creates what researchers call therapeutic consumption, where the act of purchasing mental health products provides temporary psychological relief that prevents deeper engagement with environmental factors affecting mental health. Studies from the University of Michigan found that people who spend more money on mental health apps and services actually report feeling more personal responsibility for their mental health outcomes, while simultaneously showing decreased awareness of social and economic factors contributing to their psychological states. The market for mental health solutions grows precisely because those solutions are designed to treat effects rather than causes, ensuring continuous demand for products that address suffering without eliminating the sources of that suffering. Your daily experience of this mechanism might look like subscribing to mindfulness apps while working in toxic employment conditions, purchasing self-help books about confidence while facing systematic workplace discrimination, or paying for therapy to cope with financial stress while economic policies ensure continued financial stress for your demographic. The commodified approach keeps you engaged in endless personal optimization, while the external conditions generating your need for optimization remain profitable and unexamined. The third mechanism represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this system, the neurochemical hijacking of social resistance. Friedman's theories assumed that individuals operating in free markets would naturally organize their lives to maximize personal satisfaction, and that this individual optimization would aggregate into optimal social outcomes. His framework suggested that people pursuing personal happiness through market choices would create emergent social harmony without requiring collective action or systemic intervention. However, neuroscience research from the last 2 decades reveals something far more complex about how the brain responds to systemic stress versus individual coping strategies. When you engage in positive thinking, gratitude practices, or mindset work while living under conditions of chronic stress, your brain releases dopamine and serotonin in response to the cycle relief, creating what neuroscientists call a therapeutic reward loop. Studies from Johns Hopkins University show that this neurochemical response to individual coping mechanisms actually reduces motivation for collective action or environmental change because the brain experiences chemical reward from adapting to stressful conditions rather than eliminating them. The psychological research demonstrates that humans who receive neurochemical rewards for enduring difficult circumstances show decreased activation in brain regions associated with problems and social cooperation presented with opportunity to address the root causes of those circumstances. In practical terms, this means that positive thinking about your financial struggles makes you less likely to join efforts to change economic policies affecting your financial situation. Meditation to cope with workplace stress reduces your likelihood of organizing with coworkers to improve workplace conditions. Gratitude practices about your housing situation decrease your motivation to support policies that would make housing more affordable. This mechanism operates below conscious awareness because the neurochemical rewards feel positive and beneficial in the short term. You genuinely experience relief when you reframe your struggles in positive terms, when you focus on gratitude rather than grievances, when you visualize personal success rather than systemic change. But brain imaging studies show that these practices progressively reduce activity in neural networks associated with social cognition and collective problem. The relief you feel from positive mindset work actually diminishes your capacity to recognize shared experiences with others facing similar systemic challenges. In your daily life, this shows up as feeling better about your situation through mindset work, while simultaneously feeling less connected to others in similar situations and less motivated to examine whether your situation reflects broader patterns that might benefit from collective attention. The neurochemical reward system designed to help individuals adapt to temporary challenges has been weaponized to help individuals adapt to permanent systemic dysfunction, ensuring that the psychological relief necessary for mental health actively undermines the social cooperation necessary for systemic change. The fourth mechanism builds on this neurological foundation, the strategic misdirection of analytical intelligence. Milton Friedman believed that rational individuals with access to free information would naturally make optimal choices in their economic life, and that this individual rationality would create rational economic systems. His theory suggested that people could analyze their circumstances, identify the best available option, and pursue strategies that would improve their material conditions through market participation. But contemporary psychology reveals that when highly intelligent people are encouraged to apply their analytical abilities to their internal psychological states rather than their external material condition, their intelligence becomes a liability rather than an asset. Studies from Yale's Cognitive Science Department show that individuals with high IQs who engage in extensive self-analysis around mindset, limiting beliefs, and personal psychology actually demonstrate decreased ability to accurately assess external factors affecting their well-being. The analytical capacity could be used to understand economic system, political structure, or social needs gets redirected into endless introspection about personal attitude and mental framework. This misdirection is particularly effective because it feels intellectually sophisticated and personally empowering. You apply the same analytical rigor to examining your thoughts that you might apply to understanding complex systems, but the scope of analysis remains confined to your individual psychological experience. Research from the University of Pennsylvania found that people who spend significant time analyzing their personal mindset show increased confidence in their ability to control outcomes in their lives, while simultaneously showing decreased accuracy in identifying which outcomes are actually within their control versus determined by external factors. The mechanism works by convincing your analytical mind that your thoughts are the most important variable in your life outcomes, when systems analysis would reveal that your thoughts are often responses to material conditions rather than causes of material conditions. You become expert at analyzing why you feel anxious about money, rather than analyzing economic policy that create financial insecurity. You develop sophisticated frameworks for understanding your relationship patterns, rather than examining social structures that shape relationship possibilities. You create detailed models of your personal psychology while remaining psychologically naive about the environments shaping your psychological experiences. In your daily experience, this might manifest as spending hours journaling about your beliefs around success while remaining uninformed about how wealth concentration affects opportunity distribution in your industry. You might develop intricate theories about your attachment styles while staying unaware of how economic instability affects relationship formation across your demographic. You apply your intelligence brilliantly to understanding yourself while that same intelligence remains untapped for understanding the systems that significantly influence what self you become. The fifth mechanism reveals how this psychological redirection serves specific economic function, the manufacture of productive shame. Friedman's emphasis on personal responsibility was designed to motivate individual achievement within competitive markets based on his belief that people perform better when they feel accountable for their outcomes. He theorized that personal responsibility would drive innovation, efficiency, and optimal resource allocation through individual effort and competition. What actually emerged is a psychological environment where shame about personal circumstances becomes a motivating force that increases productivity while decreasing demand. Systemic change. Research from the University of Chicago's Behavioral Economics Department found that workers who attribute their economic struggles to personal mindset deficiencies work significantly more hours, accept lower wages, and report higher job satisfaction compared to workers who attribute similar struggles to external economic factors. Even when objective measures of financial stress remain identical between the groups, the shame mechanism works by transforming reasonable emotional responses to unreasonable circumstances into evidence of personal inadequacy, requiring increased effort and decreased expectation. When you feel stressed about financial insecurity, the mindset narrative suggests that your stress indicates insufficient gratitude, limiting beliefs, or negative thinking patterns that need correction through additional work on yourself. The emotional energy that might naturally motivate you to seek better conditions or question current arrangements gets redirected into self-improvement activities that increase your tolerance for existing conditions. Studies from Harvard Business School tracked this phenomenon in corporate environments and found that employees who participated in mindset training programs showed increased willingness to work overtime without additional compensation, decreased likelihood of requesting raises or promotion, and higher rates of what researchers termed productive shame, where feelings of personal inadequacy drive increased output rather than decreased engagement. The mindset framework transforms legitimate grievances into personal growth opportunities, ensuring that your dissatisfaction becomes fuel for harder work rather than motivation for different work or better treatment. This manufactured shame is particularly insidious because it masquerades as empowerment and personal development. You feel proactive and self-directed while engaging in psychological practices that actually increase your exploitation and decrease your resistance to exploitative conditions. The energy that could fuel advocacy for yourself or others gets channeled into self-criticism and self-improvement, maintaining the illusion of agency while systematically undermining your actual agency to change your circumstances through collective action or systemic analysis. The sixth mechanism demonstrates how this individual focus prevents collective recognition of shared struggle, the atomization of common experience. Friedman's theories relied on the assumption that individual optimization would naturally aggregate into social optimization, that people pursuing their personal interest-free markets would create beneficial outcomes for society as a whole. His framework discouraged collective action or group identity, viewing these as inefficient interventions in natural market processes. Modern psychology reveals that when people facing similar systemic challenges are encouraged to view their struggles as individual psychological projects rather than shared material experiences, they lose the capacity for what sociologists call structural recognition, the ability to identify patterns in personal experiences that reflect broader social dynamics. Research from Columbia University's Sociology Department found that individuals experiencing economic stress who engage primarily in individual mindset work show significantly reduced ability to recognize when others are facing similar challenges due to similar external factors. This atomization occurs because the mindset narrative requires you to focus intensively on your unique psychological landscape, your personal limiting beliefs, your individual growth journey, and your private emotional experiences. While this internal focus might provide some psychological benefit, it systematically undermines your ability to recognize that your struggles are not isolated personal failures, but predictable outcomes of shared conditions affecting millions of people in similar circumstances. Studies from the University of California, Berkeley tracked this phenomenon across different demographic groups and found that people who attribute their challenges primarily to personal mindset factors show decreased empathy for others facing similar challenges, increased belief that their problems are uniquely personal, and reduced interest in social or political solutions to widespread issues. The mindset framework creates psychological isolation precisely when collective recognition would be most beneficial for addressing root causes of widespread suffering. In your daily life, this shows up as feeling uniquely responsible for struggles that are actually common experiences in your economic, demographic, geographic area, or social situation. You might feel ashamed of financial stress that affects the majority of people in your income bracket, or feel personally deficient for experiencing anxiety in response to objectively anxiety-provoking social conditions. The atomization ensures that you remain focused on fixing yourself rather than connecting with others who might benefit from collective action or mutual support around shared challenges. The seventh mechanism reveals how this system maintains itself across generations, the intergenerational transmission of systemic acceptance. Friedman believed that economic systems would naturally evolve toward greater efficiency and fairness as rational individuals made informed choices across time, and that each generation inherit improved conditions created by previous generations' market participation and personal. Instead, psychological research demonstrates that adults who have internalized mindset-based explanations for their circumstances unconsciously transmit these frameworks to children, creating generational patterns where systemic dysfunction becomes normalized through individual adaptation rather than collective resistance. Studies from the University of Minnesota's Developmental Psychology program found that parents who attribute their economic struggles primarily to personal mindset factors raise children who show decreased ability to recognize systemic injustice, increased tolerance for exploitation, and higher rates of self-blame when facing institutional discrimination or economic hardship. This intergenerational transmission occurs through everyday conversations where parents model individual responsibility narratives as responses to systemic problems. When children observe adults responding to economic stress with gratitude practice rather than advocacy, to workplace exploitation with mindset adjustment rather than boundary setting, or to social inequality with personal development rather than social, they internalize these response patterns as normal and appropriate ways to handle challenging circumstances. Research from Stanford's education school tracked families across 3 generations and found that children raised with mindset-focused explanations for family struggles show significantly reduced political engagement as adults, decreased likelihood of collective organizing, and increased rates of depression and anxiety when facing systemic challenges that require social solutions. The mindset narrative, transmitted through family systems, creates psychological adaptation to conditions that should provoke psychological resistance. The mechanism ensures that each generation becomes more psychologically adapted to systemic dysfunction rather than more equipped to recognize and address systemic dysfunction. Children learn to automatically internalize external problems as internal projects, ensuring continuity of the system that generates those problems. Your children learn from your example that when external conditions cause suffering, the appropriate response is internal adjustment rather than external advocacy, perpetuating cycles where systemic problems persist across generations because each generation adapts to them individually rather than addressing them collectively. The eighth and final mechanism reveals the ultimate consequence of this entire system: the weaponization of human resilience against human flourishing. Milton Friedman's economic theories assumed that human adaptability and resilience would help individuals thrive in competitive market environments, that these psychological strengths would enable people to overcome challenges and achieve prosperity through sustained effort and intelligent choice-making within free markets. What actually happened represents a profound perversion of human psychological strengths. Research from the University of Rochester's Psychology Department demonstrates that the natural human capacity for resilience, creativity, and adaptation has been systematically redirected from changing circumstances that cause suffering to accepting circumstances cause suffering. The same psychological resources that could fuel social innovation, environmental protection, and economic justice are being harvested to maintain systems that undermine social cooperation, environmental sustainability, and economic fairness. This weaponization works by reframing resilience as the ability to maintain productivity and emotional stability under increasingly difficult conditions, rather than the ability to recognize when conditions are unacceptable and require change. Studies from the American Psychological Association found that people who score higher on measures of psychological resilience in contemporary context actually show decreased likelihood of advocacy systemic change, increased tolerance for exploitative relationships, and higher rates of what researchers term adaptive dysfunction. Where psychological health maintains participation in psychologically unhealthy, the research reveals that human beings are so psychologically adaptable that they can learn to thrive in almost any condition, including conditions that systematically undermine their long-term well-being and the well-being of future generations. Your resilience, creativity, and emotional intelligence become tools for adjusting to unacceptable circumstances, rather than tools for creating acceptable circumstances. The psychological strengths that make you most human are being used to make you less human, by reducing your natural responses to injustice, exploitation, and environmental destruction. In your daily experience, this might manifest as feeling proud of your ability to stay positive despite working conditions that should be illegal, grateful for employment that doesn't provide living wages, or emotionally balanced while living in social conditions that previous generations would have found intolerable. Your psychological health becomes a measure of your adaptation to conditions that are objectively unhealthy, ensuring that the healthier you become psychologically, the less likely you are to demand healthy conditions for yourself or others. Now, let me synthesize these 8 mechanisms for you so that you can see the complete picture of how your mental energy is being systematically redirected to protect a system that generates the very suffering it then profits from treating. First, the individualization of systemic failure transforms collective problems into personal projects. Second, the commodification of mental health recovery creates profitable markets for managing symptoms without addressing causes. Third, the neurochemical hijacking of social resistance uses your brain's reward systems against your social interests. Fourth, the strategic misdirection of analytical intelligence channels your thinking power away from systemic analysis. Fifth, the manufacture of productive shame converts legitimate grievances into motivation for increased exploitation. Sixth, the atomization of common experience prevents collective recognition of shared struggles. Seventh, the intergenerational transmission of systemic acceptance ensures these patterns continue across generations. Eighth, the weaponization of human resilience against human flourishing uses your psychological strengths to maintain your psychological subjugation. The central contradiction of our current system is this: it requires your participation to function, but it cannot survive your conscious participation. The mindset narrative exists precisely because conscious examination of how the system actually operates would naturally lead to conscious resistance to how the system actually operates. Your mental health, your analytical intelligence, your emotional resilience, and your social connections are being systematically redirected away from collective problem solving and toward individual adaptation, ensuring that the problems requiring collective solutions continue to generate individual suffering that creates markets for individual solutions. The system tells you to change your mindset so that it doesn't have to change its fundamental structure, its distribution of resources, its treatment of human beings, or its relationship to environmental sustainability. Every hour you spend working on your personal psychology in response to systemic dysfunction is an hour you don't spend working with others to address systemic dysfunction. Every dollar you spend on individual mental health products is a dollar you don't spend supporting collective effort to create conditions support collective mental health. Your next step is simple but revolutionary. Start noticing when you're being encouraged to respond to external problems with internal solutions. Pay attention to how often you encounter messages suggesting that your stress about money indicates a mindset problem rather than an economic problem, that your anxiety about the future reflects personal psychological issues rather than legitimate concerns about environmental and social sustainability, or that your difficulties in relationships stem from your individual psychological patterns rather than shared challenges created by social and economic instability affecting relationship formation across your entire generation. When you begin to recognize these patterns, you'll discover something liberating. Much of what you've been taught to see as personal psychological work is actually collective social work that you've been doing in isolation. Your stress about economic insecurity isn't a personal mindset problem requiring individual therapy. It's a social problem requiring collective advocacy. Your anxiety about environmental destruction isn't a personal pessimism requiring individual optimism training. It's a legitimate response to environmental threats requiring collective. Your difficulties maintaining work-life balance aren't personal productivity problems requiring individual efficiency improvement. They're social problems requiring collective demand for humane working. The moment you stop working on yourself and start working with others to address the external conditions generate eternal suffering for millions of you discover that your personal psychological health actually improves dramatically because you are no longer trying to individually adapt to conditions that are collectively unacceptable. Your mental energy, freed from the endless project of personal optimization under suboptimal conditions, becomes available for the much more satisfying project of collective optimization of shared conditions. This is what real resistance looks like. Recognizing that your individual well-being and collective well-being are not separate projects requiring separate solutions, but the same project requiring social cooperation rather than social isolation. The system has taught you to see yourself as an individual psychological project requiring individual psychological solutions. Your liberation begins when you recognize yourself as a social being requiring social solutions to social problems that manifest as individual suffering only because social cooperation has been systematically undermined by economic theories that benefit your isolation and individual focus. Your psychological health, your analytical intelligence, your emotional resilience, and your social connections are powerful forces for creating better conditions for yourself and others when they're directed toward collective action rather than individual adaptation. The mindset narrative has convinced you that your internal experience is the most important frontier for your attention and energy. The truth is that your external conditions and the external conditions of everyone around you are the most important frontier for your attention and energy, because changing those conditions changes everyone's internal experience in ways that individual psychological work simply cannot achieve. Stop changing your mindset to fit the system. Start changing the system to fit human minds, human hearts, and human communities. That's where your real power lies, and that's what the mindset narrative exists to hide from you.